This shabby treatment of his father's memory angered Maxentius, and he began styling himself now as the dutiful son, despite the fact that he and his father had no longer even been on speaking terms. And he was thus able to add defense of father's honor to his list of reasons for continuing to stand against the Tetrarchy. But before he could exact his revenge on the Tetrarchs, who just kept poking him in the eye every chance they got, Maxentius needed to clean up his own backyard. And so, in either 310 or 311, he ordered his Praetorian prefect to lead an invasion of North Africa, crush Domitius Alexander, and unclench the usurper's stranglehold on the grain supply, a stranglehold that was undermining Maxentius's popularity in Rome. Further heightening Maxentius's sense of urgency was the rumor going around that Constantine had entered into talks with Alexander to discuss what kind of pincer move they might be able to jointly put on Italy. Whether that rumor is true or not soon became irrelevant, though, as Maxentius's prefect arrived in Carthage, steamrolled the lesser African troops, and then captured Alexander and had him put to death. With Africa back under his control, Maxentius felt that he was now fully prepared to meet whatever the Tetrarchy had to throw at him. But, before anyone had a chance to do anything, the political apple cart was once again overturned. In mid-311, after having spent the last few years peacefully resigned to the fact that he was never going to be the great puppet master that Diocletian had been, Galerius got sick. Really sick. And if you believe Eusebius, the Christian writer, who took particular joy in the suffering of the great persecutor, really, really sick. Like, no matter how many baths he took, the stench of Galerius's rotting insides could be smelt throughout the city sick. As I mentioned a few episodes back, when Galerius sensed that the end was near, he decreed an end to the great persecution, admitting that for all the violent coercion of the past decade, the Christians remained as obstinate as ever. In essence, the persecution has failed spectacularly, and it is time to admit defeat. But Galerius would fail even in his attempt to end the persecution in the East. After all, that was the only place it was really still going on anymore. And once he was dead, Maximinus Daia, who was not at all ready to admit defeat, revived it and set it back on its murderous path. But that was all someone else's problem now. In May of 311, whatever was killing Galerius, gangrene, bowel cancer, whatever, finally killed him. He was about 51 years old and had helped rule the empire, first as a Caesar, then as an Augustus, then as the senior Augustus, for about 18 years. I think at the end of the day, we have to see Galerius mostly as a failure. He was a good lieutenant, and his triumph over the Sassanids should never be discounted. But once he wielded power in his own right, his legacy boils down to the Great Persecution, a failed policy that did a lot of damage for no measurable return, and a series of attempts to manipulate the Tetrarchy to his advantage, all of which blew up in his and the Empire's face. He wasn't the worst emperor of all time, but I think you can lay the blame for a pretty good chunk of the chaos and bloodshed of the early 4th century at his doorstep. Maybe everything was destined to fall apart, but the way Galerius arranged for it to play out all but guaranteed it. Next week, the real unraveling will begin. The 4 main powers left, Maximinus Daia, Constantine, Maxentius, and Licinius against the other 2, Constantine with Licinius, and Maximinus Daia with Maxentius. After Constantine and Licinius successfully beat down Maxentius and Maximinus, they will for a time peacefully coexist, ruling over West and East respectively, until Constantine will finally decide in 324 AD that his destiny has been put off long enough. Licinius were in alliance. At about this same time back in Italy, Maxentius decided that with Galerius out of the picture, it was time to once again assert his right to power. Only this time, even more aggressively than before. To this end, he decided that if he controlled the whole Western Empire, that Licinius and Maximinus would be forced to recognize him, which meant bumping off Constantine. Embracing that whole dutiful son angle, Maxentius used Constantine's mistreatment of his father and his father's legacy as a casus belli and declared war on his brother-in-law in mid-311. That, at least, is the version of history Constantine promoted immediately following his victory over Maxentius. Whether or not this version is true, however, is an open question, and it certainly doesn't help that later in life, Constantine would change his story and promote a different version of events that has him initiating the war as a noble, and divinely inspired of course, mission to free Rome from the evil pagan tyrant Maxentius. So it is tough to say for sure who fired the first shot and why, but whoever did what when, in the spring of 312, Constantine and Maxentius would be at war. In preparation for the conflict, either because he had just declared war or because Maxentius had just declared war on him, Constantine reached out to Licinius to secure an alliance. This alliance, which would isolate Italy and ensure Constantine would not be jumped from behind while he dealt with Maxentius, was cemented by the engagement of Constantine's sister to Licinius, a marriage that would eventually take place in early 313 AD. When Maximinus Daia and Maxentius received word that Licinius and Constantine were now in cahoots, it did not take long for either man to recognize how much this shifted the balance of power away from them. So Maximinus Daia, now technically the longest-serving of the emperors, sent envoys to Maxentius in Rome, promising political recognition and full legitimacy in exchange for a military alliance. Since this is what Maxentius had wanted all along, he readily agreed to the pact, and so the battle lines were drawn. Constantine and Licinius versus Maxentius and Maximinus Daia. Over the course of the winter 311-312, a winter, I should remind you, that saw Diocletian finally die, Constantine and his advisors mulled over what to do next. For most of Constantine's inner circle, there were two paths to victory. One, remain in Gaul and wait for Maxentius to come to them, which will leave him outnumbered, fighting in enemy territory, ill-supplied, and constantly worrying about the political situation back in Italy. Or, two, remain in Gaul and hope Maxentius stays in Italy, where, besieged from all sides and forced to raise ever more taxes and levy ever more troops to stay in power, his regime will eventually be toppled from within by angry Italians, who, Constantine's advisors had it on very good authority, had grown disenchanted with the man. Either way, the smart play, the safe play, and the winning play was to remain in Gaul. Which is why Constantine announced his intention to invade Italy. Wait, what? Next week, yes, you heard me right, Constantine will invade Italy. Whether he just thought it was good strategy, or whether he really thought God was on his side and would protect him, Constantine would set off in the spring of 312 on an audacious march on Rome. He had no good reason to think he would fare any better than Severus or Galerius, who had both found Rome impenetrable. But when he arrived at the Eternal City, he would find himself the benefactor of what could be described, if you were so inclined, as a miracle. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 80,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and choose the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all your future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to go with a recommendation I can't believe I haven't gotten to yet, from listener Danny, I, Claudius by Robert Graves. There are two unabridged versions, which I normally point you to, but there is also an abridged version, read by the man himself, Sir Derek Jacobi. Tough choice. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 133, The Milvian Bridge. Last week, we laid the groundwork for Constantine's showdown with Maxentius, a showdown at the bridge, a battle that has gone down as one of the most important in world history. As momentous an event as it was, though, it is important to keep in mind that, at the time, there was absolutely no indication that the battle would take on such enormous significance down the road. At the time, it was just another clash in the Tetrarchy's running civil war, a clash fought between two ambitious men who wielded a great deal of power and wanted to wield a great deal more. It was not yet seen as a monumental battle between Christianity and paganism, and Constantine's victory was not yet being painted as the inevitable victory of God over the gods. Constantine's victory over Maxentius was a big deal. After all, it left him in sole control of the Western Empire. But it was a big deal only in the limited sense of how much it strengthened his position relative to Maximinus Daia and Licinius, his partners in/rivals for power. Had things turned out differently, that is, had Constantine not eventually wound up on top, the fact that prior to some ultimately irrelevant battle he had his men paint some random symbol on their shields would not have mattered at all. But he did wind up on top, and so it does matter. And because down the road the Battle of the Milvian Bridge will be pointed to as the moment when the Christianization of the Western world really got going, it matters a lot. Nowhere was the non-inevitability of Constantine's victory more acutely felt than in his inner circle. Having determined that the best way to handle Maxentius would be to remain in Gaul, there was much consternation in the spring of 312 as they found themselves instead organizing the invasion of Italy. Nothing, they felt, could have played more into Maxentius's hands. Constantine's forces would be numerically inferior, they would be fighting on Maxentius's turf, and perhaps most importantly of all, they would be giving Maxentius a chance to win before his domestic political troubles had a chance to bring him down without Constantine needing to lift a finger. Because word on the street was that the Romans were not as hot on Maxentius as they had once been. The masses had supported him initially because they basically supported anyone who brought the bread and circuses, but years of estrangement from Africa and the consequent disruption of the bread part of that equation had more or less soured the mob on their emperor. The aristocracy had backed him initially because they believed that he would help restore their ancient privileges, but instead, he was taxing them harder and faster